A Henderson Christmas, written by Generic and read by Eleanor Elizabeth. Summary: the Hendersons and Steve invite the Munsons over for Christmas. Eddie shook, pretending that it was because of the cold. "You right, boy?" Wayne asked. "I think when I graduated, you lost the right to call me boy," Eddie grumbled. Wayne smirked. "Nah, you'll always be boy. Better get used to it." Wayne smacked Eddie's back as they both made it up the driveway of the house. "Now, come on. It's rare these days I get invited by a nice lady for dinner." "Ew, Wayne." Eddie shook his head. "She's Dustin's mom. You can't date her, that's..." He scrunched up his face. "Look who suddenly has all sorts of rules about who people are allowed to date," Wayne said, raising an eyebrow. "I don't recall ever having such rules for you, or we wouldn't be here." "Shut up," Eddie said, a little too firm. Wayne smiled, knowing he'd won this round. Of what, neither were sure, but he had. "Let's just go." Despite saying that, he still took another breath before knocking. He didn't get another breath before it was flung open by none other than Dustin in a bright red sweater with a present knitted on it. Eddie burst into laughing. "Nice to see you in the spirit, Henderson." "Ha ha ha ha. Laugh it up," Dustin said, full of teen snark. "I got one for you, too." "What?" Eddie asked before the sweater was thrust at him. Wayne tried to hide his chuckle, but before Eddie could retaliate, Dustin kindly handed him a sweater as well. "My mom likes matching Christmas pictures," Dustin said. "Come on, she and Steve are waiting in the kitchen." The Munsons were led inside, and Eddie wondered if he'd taken a wrong turn and they'd accidentally gone into a Christmas store. The place looked like it came out of a Hallmark movie. There was, of course, a giant Christmas tree in the corner, overloaded with eclectic ornaments. But then there were at least 3 more small trees, tons of bowls just filled with ornaments, little caroler statues, reindeer stuffed animals, and the biggest nativity set that Eddie had ever seen, garlands attached to every possible surface. "Well, I'll be," Wayne said, looking around. "At least I got a tree, huh?" It was more of a bush that they'd grabbed from the forest and decorated, but Eddie had loved it. "Watch the pot, would you, dear?" Eddie heard Mrs. Henderson's voice coming from further in. "You got it," Steve said, and Eddie hated how he was so happy just to hear his voice. Wayne chuckled next to him, and Eddie realized his face had "more sap than a maple" in Wayne's description. Eddie quickly turned it to a glare at Wayne. Dustin walked to the kitchen without a thought. "Mom, Eddie and Wayne are here." It was weird that Dustin was on a first-name basis with Wayne, but there were only so many battles one could fight. "Oh," Mrs. Henderson said. "Welcome, boys. Come in. There's plenty of cookies. Help yourself." There was a clang. "Here, Steve, I've got this for now. Go greet our guests." A moment later, Steve came out of the kitchen, also wearing the red sweater Dustin had. "Hey," he said, beaming at them. "Why don't you have your sweater on?" Eddie said, still holding it. "Because I'm wearing a long-sleeve t-shirt already, and I'm gonna get hot as He cut himself off before finishing. "Fudge," he said, flinching. He'd never been one to censor himself. Wayne, Dustin, and Steve were all used to how he spoke, but he wanted Mrs. Henderson to like him. Steve snorted. "Too bad," he said, pushing the sweater at him. "Change if you want to, but you're going to wear it before the pictures. It's extremely important." He nodded over to the mantel where there was a line of maybe a dozen photos. The first was a family of 3, Mrs. Henderson, a baby, presumably Dustin, and a man he didn't recognize, presumably Dustin's father. There were 4 more photos in similar styles and poses, with Dustin aging progressively older. The next picture was of a much older Dustin, maybe 9 or 10, and just his mother. From there on, there was some variation of who was there, including an older couple, the Hendersons' parents, probably, then just an older woman. One had the buyer's family awkwardly smiling in their own matching sweaters, and the last one in the row had Steve. Eddie looked up at the real-life Steve. "But you only moved in a few months ago." Steve shrugged. "Mrs. Henderson is persistent." Behind him, Eddie saw Wayne struggling to put the sweater over his t-shirt. Eddie sighed and followed suit. Steve giggled, full-on giggled at the sight. "What? You asked for this?" "Not the sweater," Steve said, reaching up. "Your hair just frizzed out like 2 sizes." "It's not that bad," Eddie said, trying to flatten his hair out. "It's just all the static." "It's cute," Steve said. Dustin and Wayne went to go talk about... Lord only knows what those two had in common, but they got along way too well for Eddie's comfort. Steve looked back to the kitchen, then kissed Eddie's cheek. Eddie blinked, not used to the more public affection. "What was that for?" he asked. Steve groaned. "Claudia had this whole talk with me about how I don't invite you over or show any affection or anything. Worried about our relationship, or that I was still worried she'd turn me out. God, the way she looked at me, you would have thought she was asking me if I hated her." Eddie snorted. "Well, I certainly don't come over as often as when I went to your place, but she and our resident hobbit are usually around a lot more frequently. Plus, it was weird to think about having sex in Mrs. Henderson's house. It was like a church. Actually, Eddie would be more inclined to have sex in a church." "Tell me about it," Steve said, but couldn't help smiling. Eddie knew Steve hated being alone. He would have stayed over at his every night if that was at all practical. "But anyway, goal today is to prove that I know Claudia is not homophobic. So..." He reached out and held Eddie's hand, then pulled it up so he could kiss it. Eddie tried to contain the goofy smile that was threatening to spread across his face. "No making out," Dustin said. "It's Christmas." "Hey," Steve said to him. "I didn't complain when you had your 3-hour call with Susie last night." "We couldn't talk today," Dustin pouted. "Just church all day." Wayne chuckled and patted Dustin's head as Eddie and Steve went over to sit with them. "Eddie, did you get anything good for Christmas?" Eddie looked up at Wayne, both of them shrinking. Well," Eddie said. "Wayne and I have a tradition where we both give each other cash." Dustin and Steve looked at them confused. "It's an old thing. I refused to tell him what I wanted because I was a moody little shit at 13, so he just gave me money and told me to buy it myself. I loved being able to choose my own stuff, so he kept doing that, and then I tried to pay him back when I started making money, and it just became like a thing." Wayne leaned back, smiling at the story. "Oh, that's sweet," Steve said. "Dustin gave me stress." "Hey," Dustin protested. "It's a good gift." Steve lifted a book, which Eddie instantly recognized as the Silmarillion. "I could not get through 1 page. This is worse than the things I have to read in English class." Dustin rolled his eyes. "I'll make a nerd out of you yet, Stephen. Just you wait." "And what did he give to you?" Eddie asked, raising an eyebrow. Dustin beamed. "Steve's gonna teach me to drive." Steve sighed. "Don't keep talking about it. I'm gonna realize what I did eventually." Eddie chuckled. "Oh, I definitely want front row seats to that," he said. Mrs. Henderson finally came to join them, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Oh, don't you all look handsome?" she said. "The ham's in the oven. Should be enough time for the last of the presents, and then pictures before dinner." Eddie's face fell, and he looked at Wayne. Wayne finally seemed to mimic his panic. Eddie turned to Steve. "You told us not to bring anything," he hissed. "Because that's what Claudia told me to do," Steve said. "Trust me, don't worry about it." It was easy for Steve to say. Up until recently, he had money. Wayne and Eddie always had to face the stigma of being trailer trash, too cheap to be involved in these sort of things. He and Steve had agreed to no presents between the two of them because they needed to save money. "Now, Miss Claudia," Wayne spoke up, since Eddie clearly couldn't save them. "I appreciate it, but you know we can't accept anything." "Oh, I bet you certainly can," Mrs. Henderson said, taking out a box. "Technically, it's mostly from Dustin to Eddie, but it would be good to have one of these at your place, just in case." She handed a box to Eddie. Eddie looked between her, smiling all sweetly and motherly in a way he was very unused to Steve, looking smug, eating up Eddie's discomfort, to Dustin, overly hopeful, like some sort of small animal waiting for a treat. Finally to Wayne. Wayne gave him a little half shrug. Sighing, Eddie opened the gift. It was from an electronics store. "Oh," he said, finally realizing. "Aw, Dusty Buns, do I get my own radio?" "Oh, shut up," Dustin said. "And yes, you're part of the party. Now, this is for emergencies, but in general, you can keep it in your house and get in contact with any of us." "Dustin was very excited," Mrs. Henderson said, smiling at him. Wayne cleared his throat, nodding at Eddie pointedly. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Eddie said, trying his best to smile back. "And Dustin?" Mrs. Henderson lit up like the Christmas tree beside her. "All right, everyone on the couch now. Steve, could you help me for a moment?" Ever since he moved in, he'd been a picture-perfect son, desperate to try and keep Mrs. Henderson happy. Seeing them interact, Eddie could understand. Her approval was addictive to someone who hadn't had a mother figure since he was 10. Wayne was the best in the world, but there was something insanely comforting about Mrs. Henderson's presence. Steve helped her set up the camera on a tripod. Okay, go sit by Eddie, Steve dear," she said. Steve did as requested, and she framed the 4 men. "Okay, I think we're ready. I've got it on a 3-second timer." She clicked the button and then ran over, tripping over the coffee table and nearly into Wayne's lap. Wayne froze up in a way that Eddie had not ever seen him do before. He reached out to try and help Claudia stabilize, but also tried to keep his arm out of the way. She ended up falling down across the boys, then slipping onto the floor. The camera flashed, but no one was paying attention, trying to make sure she was okay. Mrs. Henderson was absolutely cracking up laughing. Her face was all screwed up, and she looked like she could hardly breathe. Hesitant, Dustin joined in, then Steve, and then Eddie. Steve helped her up, and she brushed herself off. "Oh, that's going to be my favourite picture yet." The boys cracked up, and even Wayne's smile twitched. Eddie had always liked Mrs. Henderson, but he admitted some of her pure mom energy intimidated him. He knew better than anyone that people who seemed kind and sweet on the outside were often anything but, especially towards people like him. But she really seemed just so human. And while he protested before, he'd never seen Wayne react like this. "Let's try that again, shall we?" she said, going back to the camera. "I could take the picture, Claudia," Wayne said. "Get you all in it." "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Wayne dear," she said. "You need to be in it as well. Just try and catch me this time." Wayne Munson, honest to God, blushed. Eddie wondered if he'd stepped into an alternate dimension. Again. This time, they moved the coffee table out of the way, and Claudia managed to make it to them without falling, though Wayne kept his hand hovering behind her, just in case. Just as they relaxed from posing, a timer went off in the kitchen. "Ah, the ham!" Claudia said. "Everyone, come sit at the table. Steve, will you help with the sides?" The table was round, so Eddie sat between Wayne and Steve, Dustin on Steve's other side, which forced Mrs. Henderson between Dustin and Wayne. Claudia had prepared a whole spread. No one was more willing to decry the American nuclear family and the values therein than Eddie. But as he sat there, surrounded with people he loved, he got it. Just a little. Hey there, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. It's Ella, and I hope you're having a lovely day today. Oh, we're back with some more Steddie content. I just love these two. I ship this so hard. I think most of, now I've done 2 Steddie fics. Neither of them require you to know too much about Stranger Things, because I know a lot of you haven't watched it, but you should, because it's great, and Steve and Eddie are great. But what did you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Do you ship it? Are you going to watch Stranger Things now? Have you already seen it? In which case, what's your favourite season? What's your favourite Steve via the season? Because that's an even more interesting question. But just let me know. I'll just like talking to you guys down in the comments. It's a great time. You could also, like the video if you liked it, and to boost my serotonin levels, You can also subscribe if you want to be notified whenever I make new videos. And you can hit that bell, whatever that does. I don't really know what the bell does, but the people tell you to click it, so I guess click it. You can also join the Discord server. I will link that in the description down below. It's a great time over there. Honestly, absolute hilarity, full out madness going on there, just absolute chaos, and it's a good time. So I hope you guys want to join. It's a really fun time. We're a big family over there. But until I see you again, be sure to practice some self-care. Go to bed on time. Not like me. Yes, I am recording at 3:30 in the morning again. See how I almost said 1 there? I almost lied to you. But I won't do that. I'll be honest with you. It's 3:30 in the morning now. And I'm going to go to sleep. I promise I will go to sleep once this is uploaded. And you won't have to be disappointed in me anymore. But you should do that. And you should also eat your 5 a day, because that's also important, because you need the nutrients. And you should stay hydrated. Drink some water. Have you drank water today? You probably haven't, have you? Have you drank water in the last few hours? Because you should. Chug down some water. Hydrate. Don't dehydrate. I will catch you guys laters.